The rain in Millbrook, Ohio never just fell. It hammered. It came down in long gray sheets that made the whole town look like an old photograph someone had left out in the weather. And on the last Friday of October, 17-year-old Eli Warren stood on the sidewalk outside the only home he had ever known, with 2 black garbage bags at his feet and a duffel bag slung across his shoulder, watching the rain soak through the cardboard box that held everything else he owned in the world. The front door of the small yellow house behind him was already closed. The porch light was already off. His mother, Diane, had not even waited for him to reach the end of the driveway before she went back inside. Eli did not cry. He had used up the last of his crying 2 nights ago, quietly, in the dark, with his face pressed into a pillow so that Roy would not hear him and come in to say something cruel about it. Roy was his mother's new husband. Roy had moved into the yellow house on Cypress Street a little over a year ago, and from the first week, Roy had made it clear that he did not consider Eli part of the arrangement he had married into. Roy was 44, heavy-set, with a trucker's cap he never took off and a voice that always sounded like an argument waiting to happen. Eli's mother used to be different. Before the pills, before Roy, before whatever it was that had finally gone out of her eyes somewhere around the time Eli turned 15, she had been a quiet woman who packed his school lunches with apples cut into quarters and a note folded in the napkin. She had worked 2 shifts at the county hospital back then. She had hung a wooden plaque in the kitchen that said, "This family is held together by love." The plaque was gone now. Roy had taken it down one evening without asking and thrown it in the garbage, and Diane had not said a word. The night before, Roy had stood in the doorway of Eli's bedroom with his arms crossed and told him that things were changing around the house. He said Diane was tired. He said the boy was almost a man. He said there was no room in a 2-bedroom house for 3 adults, and that Eli had until tomorrow morning to find somewhere else to go. And Eli had stood there waiting for his mother to come out of the kitchen and say something, anything, even one word that would let him believe that the woman who had cut apples into quarters was still inside her somewhere. But she had stayed at the sink. She had kept washing the same plate. And when Eli had finally walked past her to go pack, she had whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "I'm sorry, baby," and then nothing else. So now he stood on the sidewalk in the rain. 17 years old. 2 months shy of 18. A senior in high school with 3/4 of a diploma and no idea where he was going to sleep that night. In his pocket he had $41, a folded piece of paper with the address of a boy from school named Wyatt who had once said, "If you ever need a couch, man," and a small brass key on a leather cord that his grandfather had given him the summer Eli turned 8. That summer, Eli had spent 6 weeks with his grandfather Hollis out in the country, a thin, quiet, sunburned man who wore the same denim shirt every day and smelled like pipe tobacco and cedar shavings. Hollis had lived alone on a weedy stretch of property at the edge of a dead rail yard outside a town called Ashgrove, 2 counties over. Eli remembered the yard in pieces, the way you remember a dream. Long grass up to his waist. Old rails turning orange with rust. The smell of creosote in the hot air. And one enormous dark green railroad car sitting on a forgotten piece of track, half swallowed by vines and honeysuckle, leaning just a little to one side like a tired old animal that had finally decided to lie down. Hollis had called it the Evangeline. Eli had not known then, and did not know now, why a train car would have a name. His grandfather had taken him inside it only once, briefly, and Eli remembered being disappointed because his grandfather had not let him go all the way to the back. At the end of that visit, on the last morning before Eli's father came to pick him up, Hollis had pressed the small brass key into the boy's palm and closed his fingers around it and said, in a low serious voice that a grown-up usually only used with other grown-ups, "You hold on to this, son. You keep it somewhere nobody knows about. One day, when you need it, you come back." 2 months later, Eli's father had been killed on a job site when a scaffold gave way. Eli was 8. His grandfather Hollis had driven down for the funeral in an old pickup and stood at the back of the church in a suit that did not fit him, and afterward Eli had overheard him arguing with Diane in the parking lot about something to do with money, and the next day Hollis had driven home, and Eli had not seen him again. Hollis had died a little over a year ago, in his sleep, sometime in the late summer. Diane had gotten the call. She had not taken Eli to the funeral. She had said it was too far. She had said there was nothing out there for them. She had said Hollis had left his affairs in a terrible mess and that a lawyer would be in touch if any of it ever amounted to anything, which she very much doubted. That had been the end of the conversation. 3 months ago, in the middle of summer, a letter had arrived at the yellow house on Cypress Street in a thick manila envelope with Eli's name printed on it in careful typed letters. Roy had gotten to the mailbox first. Roy had opened the envelope, read the contents, and by the time Eli came home from his dishwashing shift at the diner, Roy had burned most of it in the metal barrel behind the garage. "Junk mail," Roy had said. "Old man left you a pile of nothing. Some garbage piece of property with back taxes on it. I saved you the trouble." But Roy had missed one page. A single folded sheet had slipped out of the envelope and landed behind the little wooden table in the front hall where Diane kept her keys, and Eli had found it 3 days later when he was looking for a quarter. It was a photocopy of a deed. In the corner, in a stamp that said "paid in full," was the note, per Hollis Warren's instructions, recipient's acquisition cost, $9.00, payable at collection. Below that, in his grandfather's shaky looping handwriting, written directly onto the photocopy in blue ink, were the words, "Eli. It's yours. Go see it. Take your time in the back. Hollis." Eli had stared at that page for a long time. He had folded it carefully and tucked it into the lining of his duffel bag. He had not shown it to his mother. He had not asked Roy any questions. He had simply waited, because at 15 or 16 or 17, a boy does not know what to do with a dead grandfather's property 2 counties away, and because some part of him had known, even then, that a door was going to close on the yellow house one day, and that when it did, he was going to need somewhere to go. Now the door had closed. And he was standing in the rain. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, half-soaked, and texted Wyatt. "Hey man. Roy kicked me out for real. Can I crash tonight?" The 3 dots blinked for a long time. Then Wyatt wrote back. "Bro, I'm so sorry. My dad's being a jerk this week, he's on one of his rampages. Just tonight?" Eli wrote. Wyatt took another long minute. One night, he finally wrote. "Keep it quiet. Back door after 11. And Eli said thank you, and closed his phone, and picked up his 2 garbage bags and his cardboard box, and started walking through the rain toward the bus stop. He did not look back at the yellow house. He slept on Wyatt's basement floor that night on a pile of musty blankets, and in the morning Wyatt's father came downstairs before the sun was up and told Eli to be out in 15 minutes, and Wyatt did not meet his eyes, and Eli did not blame him. He spent the next 2 nights on a bench behind the public library, and one night in the 24-hour laundromat on 4th Street, pretending to be waiting on a dryer until the woman who ran the place told him gently that she couldn't let him stay. On the 4th morning, he sat on the curb outside a gas station and ate a honey bun for breakfast and counted his money. He had $26 left. He counted it 3 times, because he could not quite believe it, and then he pulled out the folded photocopy of the deed, and he read it again in the gray morning light. Lot 17B. Old Ashgrove Switching Yard, Route 22, 2 miles east of Ashgrove, Ohio. 1 private rail car, designation Evangeline, Pullman built, 1929, 64 feet, out of service since 1965. Land lease current through the end of the following calendar year. Contact, the law office of R. Pendergast, Ashgrove. Eli had never in his life made a real decision. He had been moved around, handed down, spoken over, and quietly erased for as long as he could remember. But sitting on that cold curb with honey bun crumbs on his jeans, he made one. He was going to go see it. He was going to find the Evangeline. He was going to use the brass key that had been hanging around his neck under his shirt for 9 years, and he was going to sleep in whatever he found, because even a rusted-out train car was better than a bench behind the library. The bus from Millbrook to Ashgrove cost $11. When it dropped him at the crossroads 2 miles outside town, he was down to $15 and a single key. The law office of our Pendergast was on the second floor of a building above a hardware store on Ashgrove's Main Street. The lawyer himself was a small tired old man in his 70s with a white mustache and eyes that had seen a great deal and were not very surprised by any of it. He read the photocopy Eli slid across his desk. He looked up over his reading glasses. He said, "Well, son, I'll be." "Hollis said you'd come one day. He just didn't tell me when." Pendergast had the original deed in a file. He had Eli sign in 3 places. He asked Eli if he had $9. Eli counted out 9 $1 bills from his pocket, each one damp and soft, and laid them on the desk, and Pendergast took them, and wrote out a receipt in slow careful handwriting. "Your grandfather was very particular about the price, son. He said it had to be 9. He said it was important. I never quite understood why, but your grandfather was a man who understood things the rest of us didn't, so I stopped asking." He handed Eli a thin stack of papers and a hand-drawn map. "That land lease runs another 14 months. After that, somebody has to either pay it or move the car. I'll tell you the truth, son, moving that car is about as possible as moving a mountain with a shovel. But the lease is what it is. 14 months. You do what you can with that." He paused. "You armed? You got somebody with you?" Eli shook his head. Pendergast looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a battered flashlight and a box of shells for a flashlight he did not own, realized his mistake, put the shells back, and handed over just the flashlight. "Take this. And son, listen to me. Your grandfather Hollis was the most private man I ever knew. Whatever he put in that car, he put there for a reason. You go slow. You hear me? You go slow. And you watch who you tell." Eli thanked him and left. The walk out of Ashgrove took an hour and a half. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, and the sky over the Ohio farmland was gray and enormous and low. Eli followed Pendergast's hand-drawn map down Route 22, past a feed store and a boarded-up diner, and then down a narrower road, and then onto a dirt track that did not even have a sign. The track wound through a stand of pines, and then it opened out, and there it was. The old Ashgrove switching yard. It was half a mile of forgotten track running along the edge of a dead creek. The rails were buried in burdock and goldenrod. 2 collapsed freight cars lay on their sides like fallen animals, their ribs showing through rusted skin. A switchman's shack had caved in on itself. Everything smelled of iron and damp earth and the sweet rot of autumn leaves. And at the far end of the yard, sitting on its own length of track, half swallowed by honeysuckle and Virginia creeper, leaning just a little to one side, was the Evangeline. Eli stopped. His breath stopped with him. He had been 8 years old the last time he had seen it. In his memory it had been enormous, like a cathedral laid on its side. Now, at 17, it was smaller than his memory. But it was still huge. A dark green Pullman sleeper car, 64 feet long, crowned with a curved roof. The paint was heavily oxidized, peeling off in long curled strips, but underneath, you could still see faint gold lettering near the door, Evangeline. Beneath the lettering, in a smaller scroll, the builder's mark, Pullman Company, 1929. He walked slowly down the yard toward it through the high grass. Grasshoppers rose out of the weeds around his knees. A crow called once from somewhere in the pines. The Evangeline sat there in the late afternoon light, enormous and patient, and it seemed to Eli that it had been waiting a very long time for somebody to come. The main door was on the far side. It had a heavy iron padlock on a thick chain, and both the lock and the chain were so rusted that they looked brittle, almost fragile. Eli set down his garbage bags. He set down his cardboard box. He took off his duffel bag. He pulled the leather cord over his head. For the first time in 9 years, he took the small brass key off the cord and held it in his palm. It did not fit the padlock. The padlock was too big, too modern. The brass key was for something else. Eli stood there for a moment with the key in one hand, and then he laughed out loud, a short surprised laugh, because of course it was not for the padlock. Of course it wasn't. His grandfather had told him to take his time in the back. The key was for something inside. He picked up a rock and hit the padlock hard, and then hit it again, and on the third strike the rusted shackle snapped clean through. The chain fell away. Eli gripped the iron handle with both hands and pulled. The heavy door shrieked on its track like a living thing being woken up against its will, and then it gave, and Eli stumbled backward, and a great slow breath of dry old air came out of the Evangeline and into his face, smelling of dust and cedar and something faint and sweet, like the ghost of a perfume. He clicked on Pendergast's flashlight. He stepped up into the car. He had been expecting wreckage. He had been expecting mice and rotted floorboards and the wet reek of 40 years of mildew. What he found instead made him stop dead in the doorway with his hand still on the frame. The interior of the Evangeline was covered in dust, yes. Cobwebs hung in the upper corners like veils. A faint film of grime lay on every surface. But beneath the dust, the car was almost perfectly preserved. The walls were paneled in dark polished wood, rosewood or mahogany, with inlaid patterns along the borders. The ceiling was an arched barrel of beaten brass, soft with tarnish but unbroken. Brass sconces curved out from the walls, the bulbs long dead. A narrow corridor ran down the length of the car with a row of sleeper compartments on one side. At the near end, a small lounge opened up, with a pair of green velvet armchairs, a low round table, and a built-in bookshelf still packed with leather-bound books. A Persian runner ran the length of the hallway. The floor beneath the dust was inlaid parquet. "Oh, Grandpa," Eli whispered. He did not know he had said it until he heard his own voice. He walked slowly down the corridor. He put his hand on the wood. He pulled a book off the shelf at random, opened it, and a pressed flower fell out of it and onto the floor at his feet, crumbling slightly. He picked it up and held it on his palm, and it seemed, for a strange second, that his grandfather was standing just behind him in the corridor, watching over his shoulder. He spent the rest of that afternoon just walking through it, touching things. There were 6 sleeper compartments, each with a narrow bunk and a fold-down sink and a small writing desk. The beds still had linens on them, yellowed but intact, smelling of cedar. In one of the compartments, a pair of reading glasses sat folded on the desk next to a hardcover book with a ribbon still marking the page. A small galley kitchen at the far end still had copper pots hanging from hooks. The brass faucet turned with a groan, but of course no water came. At the very back of the car, past the last sleeper compartment, the corridor ended in a narrow oak door. The door was locked. Eli stood in front of it in the beam of his flashlight for a long time. There was an iron padlock on this door too, older than the one on the outside, smaller, blackened with age. But the padlock, he realized, was not the lock. Above the padlock, set flush into the oak, was a keyhole. A small one. Brass-rimmed. He took the key off the cord around his neck. He held it up to the keyhole. It was the same size. It was the same shape. His hands were shaking. He made himself wait. He made himself breathe. His grandfather had told him to go slow. His grandfather had told him to take his time in the back. He was standing at the back. And night was coming. He stepped away from the door. He went back up the corridor. He swept out the lounge area with an old straw broom he found in a closet. He took one of the linen sheets out of the nearest sleeper compartment, shook the dust out of it in the doorway, and spread it across one of the velvet armchairs. He unpacked his duffel bag onto the writing desk in that compartment. He set Pendergast's flashlight on the round table in the lounge, beam up, and it lit the brass ceiling like a cathedral. He sat down in the armchair in his new home and ate the last of a package of saltine crackers from his duffel bag, and he looked down the long dark corridor of the Evangeline toward the small oak door at the back, and he thought, for the first time in 4 nights, that he might sleep. He did not open the back door that night. He wanted to. Every nerve in his body was pulling him down that corridor. But he remembered his grandfather's hand on his shoulder in the hot summer of his 8th year, and the low serious voice saying, "One day, when you need it, you come back. He needed it now. But he also understood, in a way he could not have explained, that whatever was behind that door had been waiting for nearly 60 years, and that it would wait one more night. And he wanted to be ready for it. He wanted to earn it. He curled up in the velvet armchair with his jacket pulled over him like a blanket, and he listened to the wind moving through the pines outside the Evangeline, and the small ticks and settlings of the old car around him, and somewhere around midnight he fell into the first real sleep he had slept in a week. He did not know yet that the yard was watched. He did not know yet that a man in a black pickup truck had already driven past the mouth of the dirt track twice that evening, slow, headlights off, and had parked for a long minute at the crossroads before driving on. He did not know yet that his grandfather Hollis had not been a quiet old man who kept to himself because he was shy. He did not know yet that the Evangeline had not been left to rust in the Ashgrove switching yard by accident, or that the year 1965, stamped on one of the papers Pendergast had given him and which Eli had not yet read carefully, was a year in which something very specific had happened in the small town of Ashgrove, Ohio, something that had gone unsolved for almost 6 decades, and something that a handful of very powerful men had once had very good reasons to make sure stayed buried. He only knew, that first night, that he was warm. That he was dry. That no one was going to knock on a door and tell him to get out. He slept. And in the morning, when the first gray light came through the high narrow windows of the Evangeline and fell in pale stripes across the Persian runner in the hallway, Eli Warren opened his eyes in the velvet armchair, and he looked down the corridor at the small oak door at the back, and he thought, Today, I take my time in the back. Morning in the Ashgrove switching yard came in layers. First a thin silver light through the high narrow windows. Then the sound of crows somewhere over the pines. Then the slow shifting of the old car around him as the sun began to warm its green iron shell, a sequence of small creaks and ticks that sounded, if Eli let himself hear it that way, almost like the Evangeline was yawning awake with him. He sat up in the velvet armchair. He had slept in his jeans and his jacket, and his neck hurt, and his feet were cold, and none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had slept through a whole night without anyone telling him to get up and leave. He had not had to pack his garbage bags at 4 in the morning. He had not had to listen for footsteps coming down a staircase. He had simply slept, and now he had woken up, and he was still here. He sat there for a long time just looking down the dark corridor at the small oak door at the back of the car. The brass key was in his fist. He had slept with it in his hand. Before he opened anything, he told himself, he was going to make this place livable. That was something his grandfather Hollis would have said. Hollis had been a man who finished one job before he started the next. A man who had taught Eli, in those 6 weeks of the summer he was 8, how to oil a hinge and how to sharpen a knife on a whetstone and how to sweep a floor properly, from the walls and toward the center, not from one corner straight to the other. Take your time in the back, his grandfather had said. Not, run to the back. Take your time. So he took his time. He climbed down out of the Evangeline and he walked the perimeter of the yard. The dead creek ran along the south edge, slow and rust-brown and clear enough to drink from if a person boiled it, which he would. There was a collapsed switchman's shack about 50 yards up the track, and inside it he found, under a fallen beam, a cast-iron potbelly stove that had tipped over but not broken, with a length of stovepipe still attached. He found an old hand-cranked well pump by the ruins of what might once have been a station office, and when he worked the handle for 5 straight minutes it coughed up water, first brown, then clear. He found a wooden crate of kerosene lanterns in a weatherproof tin under a tarp, which could not have been sitting there since 1965 because the tarp was modern green nylon, and the lanterns inside were clean and oiled and one of them still had fuel in it. His grandfather, he realized, had come out here and prepared things. Maybe a year ago. Maybe 10 years ago. Maybe 20. Someone had been taking quiet care of this yard for a long time. He dragged the potbelly stove back to the Evangeline on a piece of old sheet metal, pushing it through the grass like a sled. He set it up in the lounge, in front of the unused brass fireplace surround that had been built into the car back in 1929 for exactly this kind of thing. He ran the stovepipe up and out through the vent that his grandfather, or more likely some Pullman workman a century ago, had left in the roof for it. He gathered firewood from the deadfall at the edge of the pines. He filled a copper pot from the galley with water from the well pump and set it on the stovetop to boil. By mid-morning, he had warmth. He had water. He had a home. He sat in the green velvet armchair with a tin cup of boiled water cooling in his hands, and he looked down the corridor at the small oak door, and he said, out loud, in the empty car, "All right, Grandpa. I'm ready." He walked the length of the corridor slowly. The pressed flower he had picked up the day before was still sitting on the little round table in the lounge. He passed the 6 sleeper compartments. He passed the last one, where he had unpacked his duffel bag onto the writing desk. He came to the narrow oak door. The iron padlock above the brass keyhole he dealt with first. It was so old and so rusted that he snapped the shackle with one hard twist of a pry bar he had found in the switchman's shack. The padlock came off in his hand, and it was so heavy and so crusted that he almost dropped it on his own foot. He set it carefully on the floor beside him. Now just the brass keyhole was left. He slid the key in. It went smoothly, like a piece coming home to the place it had been carved from. He turned it. The tumblers, somewhere inside the mechanism, moved with a small clean series of clicks that sounded, to Eli, like a whispered combination of syllables. Then the bolt slid back, and the door was open, and he stood there with his hand on the knob and could not, for a long moment, make himself turn it. He thought of his father on the scaffold, the day before the scaffold gave way, laughing at something Eli had said. He thought of his mother at the kitchen sink, whispering, "I'm sorry, baby." He thought of his grandfather in a suit that did not fit, at the back of a church. He thought, "I am here because all of those people are not." And then he turned the knob and pushed. The door opened into a compartment about 8 feet by 8 feet, at the very back of the Evangeline, behind the last sleeper compartment, where the original Pullman car had never had any compartment at all. His grandfather had built this room. That was the first thing Eli understood, standing in the doorway. The room was not original. The paneling was the same rosewood as the rest of the car, beautifully matched, but the joinery was newer, more modern, the work of a careful amateur rather than a 1929 Pullman craftsman. A small brass plaque had been mounted on the inside of the door, engraved in careful block letters. Finished by hand, H. Warren, August 1965. August 1965. His grandfather, Eli did the math quickly, would have been 23 years old. Younger than Eli himself was now, by only 6 years. The room was small and still and dry. The air in it was different from the rest of the car. Drier. Cleaner. Like a library inside a vault. A single brass sconce curved out from one wall. A roll-top desk stood against the far wall, the roll already pushed up and open. A leather-backed chair sat in front of it. A narrow iron cot ran along one wall, neatly made up with a gray wool blanket pulled tight. Above the cot, a small framed photograph was hung on a nail. Eli crossed the room and took the photograph off the wall. It was a picture of a young man in a white short-sleeved shirt with the sleeves rolled up, standing in the bright sunlight in front of the Evangeline, which looked new in the photograph, or nearly new, the dark green paint glossy, the gold lettering crisp. The young man had his hand resting on the flank of the car. He was smiling, almost shyly, at someone just off camera. And next to him, holding a little boy of maybe 3 or 4 on her hip, was a young woman in a pale summer dress. She had Eli's own dark eyes. She had his own narrow face. And the little boy on her hip, Eli saw with a slow strange sinking feeling, had his own mouth. On the back of the photograph, in his grandfather's handwriting, in blue fountain pen that had faded to soft purple, Hollis, Mary, and Thomas. Ashgrove. July 1965. Thomas. His father. Eli sat down on the iron cot. He did not remember sitting down. His legs just let him. He held the photograph in both hands and he looked at the face of the grandmother he had never known. Mary. His grandmother Mary, who had died, his mother had once told him, in an accident when Eli's father was only 4. A car accident, Diane had said, when Eli had asked, a long time ago. She did not want to talk about it. Nobody in the family had ever wanted to talk about it. He set the photograph down on the cot beside him. He turned to the desk. The roll top was open. On the writing surface, arranged neatly, as if laid out for a visitor, were three things. A thick leather-bound journal, wrapped with a leather cord. A small metal strongbox, the kind that locks with a simple key, unlocked, its lid closed but not latched. And, on top of the journal, a single sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope, in the same blue fountain pen, his grandfather had written, "For my grandson, Eli Warren, when the time has come." Eli's hands were shaking. He picked up the envelope. He slid his thumb under the flap and tore it open. The letter was 4 pages long, in careful slanted handwriting, on thin onion-skin paper. "My dear boy," it began. "If you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either you have come here because I am gone and a lawyer named Pendergast has pointed you toward this car, or you have come here because you had nowhere else to go. If it is the second, then I am more sorry than I know how to put down on paper, because I wanted to be there for you, Eli, and I was not, and I would like to tell you why." Eli sat on the iron cot with the onion-skin pages trembling in his hand, and he read. His grandfather, Hollis Warren, had been 21 years old in the spring of 1963 when he had taken a job as a bookkeeper at the Ashgrove First Federal Savings and Loan, which had been at that time the only bank in a 4-county area and the place where every farmer and shop owner and railroad man in 3 townships kept their money. Hollis had been good with numbers. Hollis had been quiet and careful, and the kind of young man who noticed things. In the winter of 1964, Hollis had noticed something. The bank's president, a man named Conrad Holloway, along with 2 of his senior officers and a silent partner from the County Board of Commissioners, had been quietly moving money, for several years, out of certain small rural accounts belonging to elderly widows, to illiterate farmhands, to families who could not read a bank statement if you handed one to them. It was not much at any one time. $20 here. 40 there. But across hundreds of accounts, across 8 years, it had added up to a very great deal of money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, in 1964 money. The money had been moved into a set of dummy accounts in the bank's own books, and from there into the personal holdings of Conrad Holloway and his 3 associates. Hollis had documented all of it. Quietly. Carefully. For almost a year. In a leather-bound ledger, with transfer dates and account numbers and the names of every single family that had been stolen from. He had planned to take it all to the State Banking Commission in Columbus in the fall of 1965. In July of 1965, Hollis had married Mary. In August, he had bought the Evangeline for $90 at a railyard auction in Cleveland and had had it brought here, to the Ashgrove switching yard, on a siding owned by an old friend of his father's. He had done this, the letter said, because he had begun to understand that he was going to need a safe place. A place that did not exist on any bank record, on any town rolls, on any property deed that Conrad Holloway could reach. He had finished the small room at the back of the Evangeline himself, with his own hands, and he had put the ledger inside it, and he had put inside it also the copies of deposit slips and canceled checks that the families did not know they had, and the bank's own internal transfer records that a man with Hollis's job could quietly get photostats of. On the night of September 11, 1965, Hollis's wife Mary had been driving home from her shift at the county hospital in Ashgrove, with their 4-year-old son Thomas asleep in the back seat, when a pickup truck with no headlights on had come around a curve on the wrong side of Route 22 and had struck her car head-on and had driven away. Thomas had survived, in the back seat. Mary had not. The sheriff at the time, a man named Vernon Holloway, had been Conrad Holloway's brother. The accident had been ruled a simple hit-and-run by an unknown driver. The case had never been solved. The pickup had never been found. Your grandmother, Hollis wrote, in the neat slanted handwriting of a man who had thought carefully about every word, was the finest human being I ever knew. I was not as finely made as she was. On the day of her funeral, I sat in the parlor of the funeral home alone with her casket for 2 hours, And I made her a promise that I have kept now for 57 years. I promised her that I would not let what they did to her go to waste. I promised her that I would wait. That I would keep the ledger where they could not find it. That one day, when our son Thomas was grown, or when his son was grown, or when enough of the men in this town who had protected Conrad Holloway had died and been buried, I would bring it out into the light. But your father died before you were old enough, Eli. And I did not trust your mother's new husband after the funeral, and I did not trust certain men in this town who were still alive, and I waited. And I waited. And I kept the ledger where it is now, in the drawer of this desk in the back of this car. And I waited for you. Eli stopped reading. He sat very still on the iron cot. He was aware of his own pulse, very fast, high up in his throat. He read the next paragraph. I am not asking you to carry my burden, Eli. I want to be clear about that. You are 17 years old as I write this. If you are reading this at 20, or 30, or 40, you are still young. What I have left you is a choice. The Evangeline itself, and the 22 acres the switching yard sits on, I have put into your name free and clear. The deed is in the strongbox on this desk, along with the actual land, which your grandfather Wilson Warren, my father, bought outright from the railroad in 1948, and which has never been a lease and never had a tax issue. Pendergast will not have told you that. Pendergast does not know. The lease story is a fiction I put into Pendergast's file 40 years ago, to discourage anyone from taking an interest. The land is yours. Free. Clear. It is worth, as of this year, something between $200,000 and $300,000 as land alone. Eli made a small sound. He did not know what the sound was. A laugh, maybe. A sob. Inside the strongbox, his grandfather wrote, "You will find the ledger. You will find the photostats. You will find a sealed affidavit from my old friend Carl Pendergast, the lawyer's father, who was the deputy clerk at the bank in 1964 and who saw some of what I saw, and who signed a sworn statement in 1966 that he was willing to corroborate everything. Carl is long dead now, but an affidavit is an affidavit. You will also find, Eli, a list of the 14 families who were stolen from, and what was taken from each of them, and what it would have been worth to them today. Some of them are gone now. But some of them still live in Ashgrove, and in the townships around it. The Bledsoes. The Whitfields. Old Ray Chenoweth, who is still out on the river road at 91. They were robbed, Eli. Quietly, patiently, over almost a decade, by men who wore suits and smiled at them in church. I am not asking you to be a crusader, my boy. I am asking you to do one thing, if you decide it is yours to do. Take what is in that strongbox to a reporter. Not a local one. A Columbus paper, or Cleveland. Take it to the State Banking Commission. Take it to the Attorney General's office if you have the nerve for it. The statute of limitations on theft is long since passed. No one will go to jail. But the Holloway family still runs a great deal of what runs in this county, and the truth, when it is finally printed, will matter. It will matter to the families. It will matter to your grandmother Mary, though she will not be here to read it. It will matter, I believe, to you. And if you decide it is not yours to do, Eli, if you decide you have had enough burdens handed to you without asking, I understand that. I will not haunt you. The land is still yours. The car is still yours. Sell the land. Sell the car. Keep the money. Start a life. Your grandmother would have understood. She would have wanted you safe before she wanted her name vindicated. I want that too. Whatever you decide, my boy, know this. I have been quietly proud of you from a distance for every year of your life. I wish I had been closer. I wish many things. But I wanted you to know that there has always been someone in the world who was on your side, even when you could not see him. And that someone built you this room, with his own hands, a long time before you were born, and waited. I love you, Eli. Go slow. Be careful who you tell. Your grandfather, Hollis Warren. Eli set the letter down on the iron cot. He sat for a long time in the small wood-paneled room his grandfather had built with his own hands in the summer of 1965. He was crying, not hard, just steadily, and he was not trying to stop. After a while he wiped his face on the sleeve of his jacket. He opened the strongbox. The ledger was there. Thick. Leather-bound. Heavy. He opened it to a page at random and saw his grandfather's young handwriting, columns of account numbers and dates and names. Pritchard, Wilma. June 4, 1963. Transfer to dummy account number 14, $18. Bledsoe, Hollis Sr. June 11, 1963. Transfer to dummy account number 14, $22. It went on for pages and pages and pages. Underneath the ledger were the photostats. Gray and grainy, but readable. Bank transfer records. Internal memos. A list, on the last page, of 14 family names, with totals written in a second column. The largest total was against the name Chenoweth, Raymond. $14,482. 00, in 1965 dollars. Eli did not have to do the math in his head to know what that would be worth now. Hundreds of thousands, at least. Maybe more. To a 91-year-old man out on the river road who had spent his whole life never quite understanding why his savings had always been thinner than they should have been. Underneath the photostats, at the very bottom of the strongbox, was the deed to the land. 22 acres. Paid in full. Wilson Warren, 1948. Transferred to Hollis Warren, 1970. Transferred, by a notarized instrument dated 3 years ago, to Eli Warren. Eli closed the strongbox. He closed the lid of the roll-top desk. He sat on the iron cot with the photograph of his grandmother Mary in one hand and the letter from his grandfather Hollis in the other. Outside, somewhere far off down the dirt track, an engine slowed. Tires on gravel. Stopped. Eli lifted his head. A door of a pickup truck shut, not quite quietly enough, across the wide still air of the switching yard. Eli stood up. He slid the letter back into its envelope and the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket. He put the photograph of his grandmother Mary into the same pocket, against his chest. He picked up the strongbox with both hands. He walked out of the small back room, pulling the oak door shut behind him, hearing the bolt slide home, and he walked quickly down the corridor of the Evangeline toward the lounge at the front, where the potbelly stove was still crackling, and where his tin cup of boiled water sat cooling on the little round table. Out the high narrow window of the lounge, across the long grass of the switching yard, Eli saw a man in a black work jacket standing very still at the mouth of the dirt track, looking down the yard toward the Evangeline, with one hand shading his eyes against the morning sun. The man was not alone. A second man was walking slowly behind him, talking on a cell phone. Eli stepped back from the window. He stood in the middle of the lounge of the Evangeline with his grandfather's strongbox heavy in his arms and his grandfather's voice still in his head, "Go slow, be careful who you tell," and he understood, suddenly and completely, that his grandfather had not been speaking in metaphors. Someone in Ashgrove had been watching this yard. Someone in Ashgrove had been waiting, just like he had, for the day somebody finally came back to the Evangeline. And that day was now. Eli set the strongbox down on the little round table in the lounge, beside his cooling tin cup. He made himself breathe. He thought, very clearly, his grandfather had thought about this day. His grandfather had thought about this for 57 years. So maybe Eli could afford to think about it for 1 minute. He did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he took the lid off the potbelly stove, and he took 4 sheets from a legal pad he had seen on the desk in the back room, and he wrote on the top sheet, in block letters, a note to himself. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket with the letter and the photograph. Then he walked out the front door of the Evangeline into the long grass of the switching yard, with his hands empty at his sides, and he stood in front of the car and waited. The 2 men walked down the yard toward him through the weeds. The one in front was tall and thin, in his 60s, with a carefully combed head of silver hair and a black work jacket that had been expensive a long time ago. The one behind was younger, maybe 40, heavy-set, still on his phone. When they got within 10 feet they stopped, and the older man gave Eli the kind of smile a man gives a dog he is not yet sure about. "Son," the older man said. "You must be Hollis Warren's boy." "Grandson," Eli said. "Grandson. Of course." "Eli, is it?" "Yes, sir." The older man glanced past Eli at the Evangeline, and for a split second, Eli saw something pass across his face, a flicker of something that was not a smile, something closer to hunger. Then it was gone, and the pleasant face came back. "I'm Dale Holloway," he said. "My father was Vernon Holloway. He was the sheriff here for many years. Your grandfather and my father knew each other. I own a little real estate concern down on Main Street, Holloway Land and Title. We've had a long interest in the old switching yard. I drove by yesterday evening and I saw smoke coming from this car, and I thought, well now, somebody's out at the Evangeline, and it has been a long time since somebody has been out at the Evangeline, and it is my duty as a neighbor to come and welcome whoever it is." "That's kind of you," Eli said. "Your grandfather and I had a standing arrangement, son. He understood, and I think he would have wanted me to tell you, that if anyone were ever to come into possession of this property, I had a right of first refusal. I've been prepared to make a generous offer on the land for a very long time. I'd like to make that offer to you now." "How generous?" Eli said. He said it flatly, without interest, the way his grandfather would have said it. $40,000, Dale Holloway said. "Cash. Today. I'll drive you to the bank myself. I know your situation is difficult, son. I knew your father. He was a good man. 40,000 is a lot of money for a 17-year-old boy with nowhere to sleep." Eli looked at him for a long quiet moment. He thought of his grandfather in the parlor of a funeral home, alone with his wife's casket, making a promise that he had kept for 57 years. He thought of the name Holloway in the letter upstairs. Conrad. Vernon. And now Dale. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Holloway," Eli said. "I'm going to need to think about it." "Of course," Dale Holloway said, smiling wider. "Of course, son. But I should mention, there's an issue with your lease on this land. A significant issue. My office has been in touch with the county about it. I'd hate to see you put a lot of work into this car and then find out you don't have the legal standing to keep it here. That would be a shame. Take my card. Call me tonight. We can resolve all of it by morning." He held out a business card. Eli took it. He put it in his jacket pocket, on top of the envelope from his grandfather. "Tonight," Dale Holloway said, and the pleasant face did not entirely hide what was behind it anymore. "Don't wait too long, son. These things move faster than a young man expects." He turned and walked back up the yard with the heavy-set man behind him, and a few minutes later Eli heard the pickup start up at the mouth of the dirt track and drive away. Eli stood in the long grass in front of the Evangeline for a long time after they were gone. He took Dale Holloway's business card out of his pocket and he looked at it. Holloway Land and Title. Established 1971. Dale Holloway, President. The son of the sheriff who had ruled Mary Warren's death a hit-and-run by an unknown driver in 1965. Eli went back inside the Evangeline. He closed the iron door behind him. He sat down at the little round table in the lounge and he made a plan. He did not call Dale Holloway. The next morning, before first light, he walked the 2 miles back into Ashgrove in the dark, with the strongbox and a canvas feed sack he had found in the switchman's shack. He sat on the bench outside Pendergast's office on Main Street and he waited until the old lawyer came up the stairs at 8 in the morning, and when Pendergast unlocked the door, Eli was standing behind him. "My word, son," Pendergast said. "You look like you have not slept." "I haven't, sir." Pendergast took one look at the canvas sack in Eli's hands, and at Eli's face, and he did not ask any questions. He unlocked the office, turned on the light, and locked the door behind them. Eli sat across from him and he opened the sack and he laid the strongbox on the desk, and he told Pendergast everything his grandfather's letter had told him. He told him about Conrad. About Vernon. About Mary. About the 14 families. About Dale Holloway standing in the switching yard the afternoon before, offering $40,000 cash and mentioning an issue with the lease. He watched Pendergast's face the whole time he talked. The old lawyer did not interrupt him once. When Eli was finished, Pendergast sat back in his chair and he took off his reading glasses and he rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands for a long time. When he lowered his hands he was smiling faintly, and his eyes were wet. "My father," Pendergast said, "told me on his deathbed that someday a Warren boy was going to walk into this office with a leather ledger in his hands, and that when that happened, I was to help him in any way he needed, and that I was not to charge him a cent. I was 27 years old. I thought my father was delirious. I have thought about that conversation every day for 31 years. He put his glasses back on. "Son. Your grandfather and my father were quiet men. They waited a very long time. I think perhaps it is now our turn to stop waiting." Pendergast made 3 phone calls that morning. The first was to a reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, a woman named Joanna Reyes who had won a state journalism prize 2 years earlier for a series on rural banking fraud in southern Ohio. Pendergast had never met her, but he had read her work. He spoke to her for 12 minutes. When he hung up, he told Eli that Joanna Reyes would be in Ashgrove by 4 that afternoon. The second call was to the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions in Columbus, where Pendergast had an old law school classmate who had spent his whole career on banking oversight. Pendergast spoke to him for 9 minutes. When he hung up, he told Eli that the division would open a formal inquiry within 48 hours, that the statute of limitations on criminal theft had indeed passed but that the statute on civil recovery, fraud, and trust violation, under Ohio Code as it applied to the original bank's successor entities, had not, and that the successor bank, which was now called Ashgrove Federal and which was still majority-owned by the Holloway family estate, was going to have a very difficult 6 months. The third call was to the Ohio Attorney General's office. Pendergast spoke to an assistant attorney general for almost 20 minutes. When he hung up, he told Eli that they were going to look at the 1965 accident very carefully, and that while the driver of the truck that had struck Mary Warren was very likely dead of old age by now, the cover-up of a vehicular homicide did not have the same statute of limitations as the homicide itself, and that there were several men in Ashgrove who had been young deputies in 1965 and who were still alive, and that those men were going to have to answer some questions under oath that had not been asked of them in 57 years. Joanna Reyes drove up from Columbus that afternoon in a gray hatchback with a laptop bag and a small recorder and a notebook, and she met Eli and Pendergast in Pendergast's office, and they spread the contents of the strongbox across the conference table, and she photographed every page of the ledger. She photographed every photostat. She photographed the deed and the affidavit signed by Carl Pendergast in 1966. She interviewed Eli for 2 hours about his grandfather, about the letter, about finding the sealed room. She asked him careful, kind questions. When she was finished, she looked at Pendergast and she said, "This is going to be a 3-part series. It is going to run above the fold. I need 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Pendergast said. 2 weeks to verify everything, Joanna said. To cross-check the ledger entries against the bank's archived microfilm, which I have a source for. To interview the surviving families. To sit in the Attorney General's office while they open the 1965 case file. I am not running a word of this until all of it stands up. Your grandfather waited 57 years for the truth to come out, Mr. Warren. He will not mind if we take 14 more days to make sure it comes out the right way." Eli nodded. He could not speak. He was not sure he had spoken more than 10 words in the last hour. For the next 2 weeks, Eli stayed at the Evangeline. Pendergast arranged, quietly and through a friend, for a county sheriff's deputy, not one of the old ones, a young one, new to the county, to drive past the mouth of the dirt track twice a night. Dale Holloway called Pendergast's office 4 times in those 2 weeks. Pendergast did not return the calls. On the afternoon of the 9th day, Dale Holloway drove his pickup halfway down the dirt track, and the young deputy happened to be parked at the crossroads, and Dale Holloway saw the patrol car, and he turned around and drove back out, and he did not come again. Eli kept working on the Evangeline. He washed the windows. He oiled the hinges. He scrubbed the parquet floor. He repaired the brass sconces with supplies he bought on credit at the Ashgrove hardware store, where the old man behind the counter, who had known Hollis, let him sign his name on a page in a ledger book and told him to pay him back whenever he could. Eli took the photograph of his grandmother Mary down from the wall of the small back room, and he put it on the little round table in the lounge, where he could see it while he worked. On a Thursday morning, 15 days after Eli had first walked into Pendergast's office, the first article in the Columbus Dispatch ran above the fold, on the front page. The Ashgrove Ledger. The headline ran across 4 columns. Underneath, in the subhead, for 57 years, a small Ohio town buried a crime against its poorest families. A grandson's inheritance has finally opened the door. Joanna Reyes had done exactly what she said she would do. The article was careful, quiet, and devastating. It named Conrad Holloway. It named Vernon Holloway. It named the 14 families, with their permission, each of them interviewed in their kitchens and on their porches. Ray Chenoweth, 91, on the River Road, had been interviewed sitting in a rocking chair with a quilt across his knees, and he had said only one thing that the article quoted directly. "I always knew. I could not have told you how I knew. But I always knew." The article ended, the first of 3 parts, with the line, "The ledger survived because one man refused to let it die." His name was Hollis Warren. He died last year. He was not able to see this morning's sunrise. But somewhere, I think, he is seeing it anyway. The second article, a week later, went after the Holloway family directly. Ashgrove Federal Bank's successor liability. The civil fraud exposure. The Ohio Division of Financial Institutions had frozen certain accounts pending inquiry. The Attorney General had impaneled a grand jury. Dale Holloway's real estate concern, Holloway Land and Title, was named as a subsidiary of the original Holloway Holding Company, which had been capitalized, in 1968, with funds that the ledger now identified as having come directly out of the dummy accounts. The third article was about Eli. Joanna Reyes had not wanted to write it, and Eli had not wanted her to. They had argued about it gently for 3 days. In the end, they had compromised. The third article was 2 columns long. It did not run his photograph. It did not give the address of the Evangeline or the location of the switching yard. It said only that the ledger had come into the light because a 17-year-old boy, put out of his home and with nowhere else to go, had walked 2 counties east to a piece of land his grandfather had left him, and had opened a door. That was all. It was enough. The Columbus Dispatch series won the Ohio Press Association's investigative award in May. The Ashgrove Federal Bank settled the civil fraud suit in June for an amount that the Dispatch described, in a follow-up story, as substantial. Restitution checks were issued that autumn to the surviving members of the 14 original families, calculated by a court-appointed forensic accountant at the 1965 theft amounts compounded at reasonable interest through 2025. Ray Chenoweth's family received $406,000. The Bledsoe family received $339,000. The smallest payout, to the descendants of a farmhand named Willard Pratt who had been dead since 1972, came to $88,000 and went to his granddaughter in Toledo, a 34-year-old nurse who had never known her grandfather had been robbed of anything. Dale Holloway was not charged with any crime. The statute of limitations had passed on the original theft. But Holloway Land and Title, which had been built on the foundation of his father's and uncle's fraud, was ordered as part of the civil settlement to divest certain holdings, including a number of parcels of land along the old rail corridor outside Ashgrove, and Dale Holloway stopped going to the Methodist Church on Sundays, and he did not run for the County Board of Commissioners the next year, and 2 of his 3 adult children stopped taking his phone calls after the second Dispatch article ran. 2 former deputies of Vernon Holloway's, men in their late 70s now, sat for depositions in the Attorney General's inquiry into the 1965 accident. One of them, a man named Earl Prentice, who had been 23 years old when Mary Warren was struck, broke down in the deposition and admitted, on the record, that on the evening of September 11, 1965, he had been instructed by Sheriff Vernon Holloway to tow a certain pickup truck out of a certain ditch behind a certain barn in the northern part of the county, and to take the truck directly to a scrapyard in Youngstown, and to not file a report. The truck had had severe front-end damage. The truck had belonged to a cousin of Conrad Holloway's who had a drinking problem. The cousin had been dead since 1991. Earl Prentice had never told anyone what he had done. He had not slept a full night in 57 years. He sat in the deposition room and cried for almost an hour before they let him go. The Attorney General's office issued a formal finding in October, 57 years and 1 month after Mary Warren had died. The 1965 accident was reclassified. The driver was named posthumously. The cover-up was documented. Mary's name, which had been written on a small gray stone in the Ashgrove Municipal Cemetery for more than half a century, was re-engraved, at the Attorney General's private request and at the state's expense, with her full name, her birth year, her death year, and underneath, the words, "Beloved wife of Hollis. Beloved mother of Thomas." Her case was finally closed in October of 2026, not because her killer was ever punished, but because the truth of what had happened to her was, at long last, a matter of public record. Eli did not attend the re-engraving. He sent flowers. He did not go to the deposition. He did not give television interviews. He let Joanna Reyes write what she wrote, and he let Pendergast handle everything else, and he stayed at the Evangeline. 2 months after the first Dispatch article ran, a letter arrived for him at Pendergast's office in a pale blue envelope. The return address was the yellow house on Cypress Street in Millbrook. Eli opened it in Pendergast's office, with Pendergast watching, because he had promised Pendergast he would open it there and not alone. The letter was from his mother, Diane. It was 3 pages long. It said, in the first paragraph, that she had seen the Dispatch article. It said, in the second paragraph, that she had not known. It said, in the third paragraph, that Roy had lost his job at the trucking company in August, and that Roy had left her in September, and that she was alone in the house on Cypress Street and could not keep up with the mortgage, and that she was sorry. The word sorry appeared 11 times across the 3 pages. The last page asked, not in so many words but clearly enough, for money. Eli read the letter twice. He folded it. He put it in his jacket pocket. He did not answer it that day. He waited 2 weeks. Then he wrote back. His letter was 1 page. He wrote it by hand. He said, "Mom, I am glad Roy is gone. I hope you are all right. I am not going to send you money. I am going to send Grandpa Hollis's lawyer, a man named Pendergast, to talk to you about the mortgage on the house. If you want, he will help you sell it, and he will help you find a small apartment somewhere, and he will help you with a rehab program for the pills if you want one. All of that I will pay for. But you will have to want it. You will have to ask for it. You will have to do the work. I am not angry with you anymore, Mom. I am not angry with you because I am not living in your house anymore, and I am not going to. I have a home now. It is not the kind of home most people would recognize. But it is mine. Grandpa Hollis left it to me. He left me a lot of things. I wish he had left me to you, but he could not, and I understand why. Please take care of yourself. Your son, Eli." He sent the letter. Pendergast drove up to Millbrook the following week. Diane signed the papers to sell the house. Pendergast found her a studio apartment on the edge of Millbrook and a drug and alcohol counselor at the county hospital where she had once worked 2 shifts, and Diane, to everyone's surprise including her own, showed up to the counselor's office on a Tuesday morning and kept showing up. Eli did not see her for a long time. But they began to write to each other, slowly, every few weeks, and the letters got a little easier every time. Of the land around the Evangeline, Eli sold 9 acres, the back 9 that ran down to the Dead Creek. The buyer was the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, which was expanding a state greenway along that stretch of the old rail corridor. Eli sold the 9 acres for $188,000. He kept the 13 acres immediately around the Evangeline and the old switchman's shack. With the money, he did 4 things. He paid off the hardware store ledger. He bought the old man behind the counter a bottle of good bourbon for his kindness, and he wrote him a check for 5 times what he owed, and the old man tried to refuse it, and Eli insisted. He hired a carpenter, a restoration specialist from Cleveland who had worked on historic rail cars, and together they spent 6 months bringing the Evangeline back to what it had been. The dark green paint was stripped and redone. The gold lettering was restored. The brass was polished. The parquet was sanded and refinished. The potbelly stove was replaced with a proper wood stove, properly vented, properly insulated. The Evangeline did not become a museum. It became a house. Eli's house. He set up a scholarship fund at the Ashgrove High School, administered by Pendergast, in the name of Mary Warren. It was for students in their senior year who, for any reason, did not have a safe place to live. It paid for a deposit on an apartment, the first month's rent, and a stipend through the end of the school year. In the first year, it helped 2 students. In the second year, it helped 4. And he finished high school. He enrolled at the Ashgrove Public School as a transfer student for the spring semester. He graduated, in a used blue cap and gown, on a sunny day in May, with Pendergast in the second row and Joanna Reyes in the third, and a seat beside Pendergast kept empty, by unspoken agreement, for his grandfather Hollis. He was 18 years old by then. He was accepted to Ohio State in Columbus on a full academic scholarship he had not expected, for the fall. On the evening before he left for Columbus, he walked out of the Evangeline into the long grass of the switching yard, and he stood in front of the car in the orange light of late August. He had left the small back room exactly as his grandfather had built it. The iron cot. The roll-top desk. The brass sconce. The photograph of Mary on the wall, where he had put it back after the strongbox was empty. The strongbox itself was at Pendergast's office now, in a safe, where it would stay. But everything else in the small back room was as Hollis had left it. Eli had moved his own things into the front compartments. He slept in the sleeper compartment nearest the lounge. He studied at the writing desk in the compartment next to that. The back room he kept for his grandfather. He had not locked the oak door since the morning he first opened it. He thought about that now, standing in front of the Evangeline with the strongbox empty and the lawsuit settled and the 14 families made whole and his mother clean for 10 months and his grandmother's name on a stone that finally said who she had been. He thought about a door that had been sealed for 60 years, with a brass key on a leather cord around an 8-year-old boy's neck, and about what it had taken for that door to open, and about what it had cost, and about what it had made possible. The door was open now. The door would not be sealed again. He understood something then that he could not have put into words if someone had asked him to. He understood that a thing that is locked is not finished. That a thing that is hidden is not lost. That his grandfather had not been waiting all those years out of bitterness, or out of fear, but out of faith. Faith that a day would come. Faith that a boy would come. Faith that some part of what had been taken from Mary Warren, and from 14 families, and from a quiet young bookkeeper in 1965, could still, one day, a long time later, be given back. Eli stood there in the last light of the summer, and he did not cry. He had done his crying in the small back room on the first morning, and that had been enough. He stood there instead with his hands in his pockets, and he said, quietly, so quietly that the words hardly made it out of his mouth, "Thank you, Grandpa." Then he turned, and he walked back up the steps of the Evangeline, and he went inside, and he lit a lamp, and he made himself supper, and he got ready for school. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.